I am Andrew Brandstetter.
I'm Chase Sacco.
I'm Lucas Shorter.
I'm Chris Zaccarelli, and our topic is gun control, and we're open for questions.
Guys, would you mind just starting off by talking about really generally what that term means, gun control, so sort of what types of control?
Our definition for it is the regulation of the sale and use of firearms.
Yes, that's the dictionary definition of it. So that would encompass anything from, or would encompass like all the governmental laws that vary from state to state, country to country.
Okay. Can you be a little more specific on the types of controls?
Okay, so if we're speaking strictly state to state, different states may have stricter or less strict gun laws when it comes to carrying the guns, types of guns. There's some that are just about the same across the board with like machine guns. You have to have special tax stamp to get that. You can't just get that in the state. So that is one type of control that varies from state to state. And then
We're talking about more like purchasing.
right, the
firearms.
background checks
Yeah.
as well with the purchase.
I like the control part.
Guys, where are you at on regulating gun control with regard to types of guns that are available to the general public? So, for example.
So we can go
Like individually?
Yeah. So maybe you could kind of go through, and specifically think about like, being a gun owner, having a gun for home protection, right? Versus, versus having an AR, an AR in my collection or an AK or a modified M16. I think about those are more military weapons. So what are your thoughts on what we should as citizens be able to have and maybe what we shouldn't be have access to and why?
For me personally, I think that citizens should be allowed to have firearms to protect themselves. Now, when we're talking about like machine guns and like military grade rifles and everything like that, I don't think we should completely ban them per se, but just have very like restrictions placed on them.
Okay.
Like it almost like discourage people from buying them.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Like me as a gun owner, like I'm completely for everyone having guns, like for protection, for everything. Like I hunt and everything, so I mean I know how to use a weapon like properly. So I mean whatever we need to do, just like better classes or. But I mean I'm not like for like stricter gun laws, like take away guns or anything. Just like maybe like throw a background check. That'd be fine.
Okay. So maybe different like layers?
Yeah.
Okay. Personally, I think it's kind of good where it's at right now. If you look at the U.S. laws for types of weapons available, I think with handguns and rifles, shotguns, I think everything, because maybe the age should be raised for rifles would be okay in classes or whatever. We can get into that later. But as far as the types of guns, I think it's a fairly set system that we have right now. That's pretty safe because getting more dangerous in automatic weapons, short-barreled rifles, those do require a lot more time, effort, and will take like up to a year or more.
Is there a practicality issue? Like, so you guys have all mentioned, okay, so hunting, no problem, right? We've got our different weapons for hunting. Home protection, we've got our different weapons for home protection. But do you think that there's a line that might get drawn? So you just mentioned military grade weapons, short barrel rifles. At what point does it like stop making sense for us as civilians to have some of those weapons?
Like, I don't think you need a freaking bazooka or something like that to protect yourself. But I mean, like an AR, maybe like a handheld pistol. I mean, that'd be completely fine. Like, I mean, I don't think there is a line to like what you can have, cannot have, but just something like that.
I think with those weapons, when you're looking at it, the actual danger or threat they pose to society is minimal. With all of the crimes, most every violent crime is not committed by a guy that waited a year to get a suppressor for his rifle that is a short barrel rifle, and he paid a bunch of money, went through a bunch of background checks to get that. I think that's a very, very small fraction of crimes. Well, we have the information for it, we can find that. So that, I think, just comes more of maybe a rights issue. I wouldn't go as far to say that military, like rocket launchers, stuff like that, because you don't see that around, I think. I'm sure people could get it. It's going to be difficult. I think that's okay. It comes down, to me personally, like a rights issue. The Second Amendment does say you have the right to have it,
Right.
regardless. And the original intent is to protect from tyranny in the long run. Nobody looks at that. In the short run, it doesn't seem like something that's ever likely. But in the long term, that is just, in my opinion, an essential right. It should just kind of stay about the same.
So I'm with Sokka on the gun control laws. Like, I think that maybe they could throw in like a more thorough background check, and like maybe even a class, like they enforce that in Iceland.
Okay.
As far as the kind of classifications, you mentioned like the military grade, and maybe people, even with their Second Amendment rights, maybe shouldn't have access to that, or something like that. Do you think if it started becoming policy or law that the government is defining what types of firearms people can have, not necessarily, for protecting themselves. In the case of, like a bazooka, that's a little bit of an extreme. Most people aren't going to try that. But like for ARs, a lot of people like the ARs because they're like Legos for grown-ups. You can interchange the parts, you can make them look like you want, but they get them because they enjoy shooting them. Not at a person or necessarily in self-defense, but for the sport of shooting targets or what have you. Do you think if it goes down the line to where government is regulating what's to keep that from going over to, say, vehicles and saying, well, certain people shouldn't be able to buy this level of sports car because it can do 250 miles an hour as opposed to this one, so that makes that sports car more dangerous. So you shouldn't have that because it's kind of the same parallel. Firearms is a hot button topic, but if you go off of the premise on people's rights, why shouldn't I be able to buy a fast car just because I want one? Why shouldn't I be able to buy a certain type of weapon just because I want one for my own personal use and collection, if you will? Do you think that's a slippery slope that it could start going down to?
Yeah, I think it really is. And I think that's one of the reasons that we take more of a stance, at least I do, against bans, not necessarily more control. That, in my opinion, could be a good thing. More control, more classes, whatever. But full bans on types of weapons or whatever, I think can be detrimental for weapons in general, or firearms in general. But yeah, I think it is a slippery slope that could eventually translate once that mentality becomes acceptable. Once it's okay to do A, then do this and that.
Someone might say to you that if you combine the populations of several different European countries, you would get the same population roughly as the United States. Maybe 7 or 8 different European countries to get the same population. And they have a quarter of the number of gun deaths that we do. How would you respond to somebody who says that it's the difference between their government regulation of it and maybe our less regulation?
So I did not focus as much on all of Europe, but I took specific cases of countries in Europe, well-developed countries. So, for example, I'll start with Iceland, and then I'll go to slightly lesser developed country in Brazil to compare the gun laws from those two and how that plays out. So Iceland is another, you could say, gun-loving country. In Europe, they have, I believe it's 6 guns per 100,000 people, or something, which is high for a country that's not the United States. Yet their firearm homicide rate in 2017, I think, was less than 5. And a lot of experts that I read about this were saying that could in part be due to the classes, the culture around it, the mentality. And of course, you could say Iceland doesn't have the same, it's a different country, so it doesn't have the same societal, economical problems the United States does. But the other countries, I know Great Britain, I don't have the exact number, but they have a very high number of murders, but it's just with knives. It's still very high and comparable to the gun deaths in the United States.
Could you talk about, I feel like I've heard you guys talk about, what you believe or some of the arguments, for whether we should restrict guns more or not. Could you talk a little bit about the authority of the government to do that? Like, so not so much should they, but can they? How much restriction can the government?
They definitely could beef up like the background checks and everything on people that are purchasing firearms. So, for example, if you're like a convicted felon and you just get out of prison, there should be like a time period where you can wait like 5 to 10 years, whatever long, where you're able to purchase another firearm. And another thing they could do is like to eliminate from people just spontaneously buying firearms, have like a waiting period of like 10 days or however long until you actually receive the weapon. Because most people you see that spontaneously buy those firearms are looking to use them almost immediately.
Okay. So I'm hearing should though. What about can? Can the government
I don't
ban weapons?
I think,
They ban.
no, I think that would be an infringement of like a basic right in living in this country.
So what are the limits then on
I think
the government's authority to
the
regulate?
limits should go as far as
Should or yes?
well, I guess they could do a lot of things without us doing anything about it to a point. But I don't think, it's kind of hard not to say should with that.
I mean, should they? Yes, but will they?
It will again. Like, suppose, just as a hypothetical, that the federal government was determined to restrict guns as much as they were legally allowed to do so. What would that be?
I think that's going to come down to really the people voting on it and their interpretation of the Second Amendment. If they're looking at it, because you could take the argument of, the founding fathers were talking about muskets, right? They weren't talking about you being able to go into the corner store and get an AR-15 within 20 minutes of the background check, right? But that, you don't hear that argument with First and Fourth Amendments, with speech rights or media communications, anything like that, which clearly has evolved in the past 200 years. But I think I may have gone off a little bit from your original point with that. I think, it would come if the Second Amendment reads the exact as should have enough to regulate the law. I don't want to mess it up saying that. So we can-
Okay, so the Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
I mean, when I'm reading that, I guess, or when I would hope other people read that too, you see that as, firearms cannot be banned. The weapons cannot be banned. And it needs to be, I kind of see that as saying it needs to be enough to keep a necessary militia of the people, of the civilians, not a government-funded militia, not anything like that. And we can see clearly today there is, more than enough guns in the United States. There's 393 million civilian owned firearms in the United States. That's 120 guns per 100 people, meaning you could arm everybody with a gun and have 20 left over. And the U.S. military has 4.4 million guns. So, in that sense, I think it would come to when they're banning it so much that it's like negligible. Like you can barely get enough bullets for range time to practice. You can not do it as a hobby. You can't do it as a sport. You don't have it enough to where you can practice it and be proficient and safe. I guess, yeah.
I want to piggyback on the government or the regulation side of things as far as background checks and registration of firearms. I'm a firearms dealer, so I'm interested to hear your all's take on registration of firearms and background checks. you come and you purchase a firearm from me, I legally have to document that with the ATF, with the FBI. If you're going in to purchase, I run your background check. If you've got concealed carry permit or military or police permit, I have to note that. But what is your thought when it goes to the private sector? Because person-to-person, citizen transfers they're not regulated. Once you have a firearm, if I want to sell it to you, I can just sell it to him and there's no record of that transaction whatsoever. If I own a vehicle and it's registered and I sell it to him, there's a record of that transaction and there's also a paper trail. I'm interested to hear your all's thoughts and opinions on that, if the person-to-person transactions, if you think those should also be regulated or tracked.
Individually?
You go.
Yeah, I'd be interested in individual.
So for the person-to-person selling of firearms, I think that there should be a paper trail, because you can just give somebody a firearm and have them go shoot somebody and it's registered in your name, and the police comes after you. So if you don't have that document or certificate saying that you sold it to them, then it's just all on you.
Yeah, I'm kind of for that, but I mean, I have a few points. It says over 118 million applicants for firearm transfers and permits were subject to background checks, and about 2.1 million applicants, or 1.8%, were denied. So,
That helps to show that background checks are effective, and at least, so you see 2.1 million people that the background checks deemed cannot get a gun. That's 2.1 million people that shouldn't have a gun, probably. So that is safe, and I'm the same with them. I do not think that should be allowed. I think if you want to sell me a gun as an individual, we need to just go to the gun shop, and for one, it's a safe place to do a transfer of a gun. You don't want to just meet a stranger to buy his gun. And then their background check can be done on both people and have a paper trail that's in the government database for that. Yeah.
So I agree with them. Like, I think it was probably a good thing that those people got denied, like, the transfer of the weapons. And I think there should be, like, a paper trail. You know what I mean?
Because, I mean, in reality, if you're a criminal planning on doing a crime with a gun, you're probably not, I mean, if you're a dumb criminal, I guess you might just go to the gun shop and buy a gun, but they're just going to go and get unregistered a gun with the serial number filed off, and because there's plenty of those in circulation, probably more than registered firearms.
My question would be, one of my questions would be, if the Second Amendment is talking about, well, first, so on opposite sides of the spectrum, someone might respond to you by saying, the words regulated and militia are in the first sentence of the Second Amendment. We already have a regulated militia called the National Guard. Why should we have individual citizens walking around with guns? What would you say to that?
I would say that after that it says the right of the people. To me, that reads the previous sentence, talking about the people, well-regulated militia by the people, that would be civilians, because the National Guard, regardless, is a government, or I guess state. It's a state, right? I may be wrong on that. I mean, I guess in a situation, the National Guard could just rise up, but if the government is in control of that, it wouldn't be technically civilians.
Which I guess leads me to the other end of the spectrum. My question would be, if the purpose of the Second Amendment is to make sure that the people have the ability to rise up in the case of a tyranny, as you mentioned before, whatever, doesn't further regulation of, noting who has guns and having a list of the people, potential rebels, as it were,
Yeah.
doesn't that actually limit that power?
I think it does, but over the years, as the country's grown and things are more dynamic, everybody kind of just agreed that this is an okay thing. Like, we're okay with this as a people to have background checks, to have gun sales tracked, because we see that that's more safe for everybody else. So I think with cases like that, where it's more of a